Welcome in, and this is another edition of the Legacy Right, and we got yet again more special guests coming on. But before we jump to the intro of the intro of the intro of the show, uh, like I said, we are back. Like Lysander Spooner says, hello. Legacy Right. I am the legacy of Jennifer and Kaiser. This is Andrew Joseph with Max Sterner in the background because we're fighting for the future that most men just don't really give a shit about anymore. And that's what's sad. So that's what's sad. I mean, and we'll jump into some future stuff, some past the future stuff as well, because there's something to say about this quote behind Andrew that you're seeing, and you can actually go and dive into Exodus and kind of see what that quote's really about, in my opinion. So, but yeah, this is another edition. We have Alex Bernardo. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Yeah, from Protestant Libertarian at Pro Liberty. Over on X, if you want to follow him, if you haven't already. If you haven't, you probably live under a rock. So he's and but let's throw in some ads first though. Yeah, we gotta throw the plug. So fanghornforesters.com. Fanghorn, the leader of the Ents in Lord of the Rings. Well, that's where you get fanghornforesters.com. And for all your woodworking needs and necessities, knickknacks, bowls, knife cutting boards, coasters, or actual construction, such as decks, doors, countertops, tables. I mean, you name it. Go over to fanghornforesters.com. You can find the information right there, email, listing, phone number, and go and put in a bid and see what else you can finagle out of Mr. Jonah and my cousin. I gotta plug this out for. So fanghornforesters.com, and let's get to the show. So how is everything going today, Andrew?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks. How you doing, Zach?
I'm doing all right. So feeling a little bit better, man. Been a horrible month and a half. I've been fighting anxiety attacks, and then next thing you know, I had stomach issues and digestion, and it's just not good. So, but we're back in the saddle, and let's jump into it. So,
and
to start us off, Alex, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners if they haven't listened to you before? Make some plugs of your own.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. My name is, like you said, is Alex Bernardo, and I'm the host of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast over on the Libertarian Christian Institute, which is a show that combines biblical studies and political philosophy. It's kind of what I like to do. And that's really my interest range. I've been a libertarian for, I guess at this point, it's 2024. So I guess about 8 years now. It doesn't seem like it's been that long. But yeah, I've been a libertarian for a while, very committed to that philosophy, but also trying to integrate how biblical theology and biblical studies can fit within a libertarian framework of understanding the world. And I think there's a lot of really interesting overlap there. And that's just kind of what my show explores. I would recommend if you are listening to this and you have heard my show before, go to libertarianchristians.org. That's our organization's website. There's a lot of great podcasts, a lot of great content over there. A lot of us write articles that get published on that website. So a lot of good stuff if you're interested in the intersection between Christianity and libertarianism. And there are Christians from all different denominations and theological backgrounds over there. So there's a lot of healthy diversity on the Libertarian Christian Institute. So go check all that stuff out.
Fantastic. And what's interesting about the libertarian aspect with Christianity is there is a lot of parallel, in my opinion, especially when you look into the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus and his ministry. When it all comes down to it, it's voluntary. It's voluntary attributes. So that's what libertarianism is all about, or anarchism, as I would want to promote more for, rather than call myself a libertarian, because I think the partyarchy has kind of been muddled and poisoned. The politics doesn't work. So, but when it comes down to it, voluntarism, whether you want to call it libertarianism or anarchy or agorism or counter economics or just straightforward, positive relationships with people. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's all about love. And what did Jesus teach? I mean, besides redeeming us of our sins and opening up the gates of heaven when he was crucified, if you have faith in that and believe in that? Not everybody believes in that. But yeah, that's where it begins. Like, it's all about love. Love conquers all.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And again, like, as libertarians and as Christians, we want a world where there's peace and love and freedom. Like, those are the values that we should be striving for. And I think that it's impossible. It's like you said, this is the mistake that a lot of progressive Christians make when they read the Bible, is they just assume that because the church and the writers of the New Testament talk about charity, that therefore means that we need a large socialist state to redistribute wealth to those that are in need. And that's not the case at all. The challenge of the New Testament is that if you call yourself a Christian, you have an obligation to be generous towards those that are in your life, especially those that are in need. And we have to do that as an aspect of our as an aspect of our moral obligation to God. But that can't be coerced or compelled by the state. And so that's why, like, I think it's so important for you to highlight that distinction, that Jesus is all about voluntary charity. I think a lot of people see the charity but miss the voluntary aspect of that. And for us as Christians, like, if we're not being generous with our money, then that's a problem morally for us. What is also a problem is to assume that the state needs to go and take a bunch of money from other people and then redistribute it to the people that the state thinks deserves it, which is always the way that progressive Christians seem to construe this. And there's nothing biblical about that at all.
No, it's in the socialist aspect, and I know it gets kind of filtered down as if socialism can be misconstrued to a good thing, and there's some positive aspects. There's positive aspects to everything, but there's also drawbacks to everything. I mean, there's radicalism in Christianity, Judaism, Islam specifically now in today's world, and I mean, I think a lot of that has everything to do with politics and impoverishment, that the politics and the interventions of in the socialist philosophy, in my opinion, the distributing of stolen monies from one end to the next causes an irreparable relationship. So it's kind of hard to mend. What's the word I'm looking for, Andrew?
I guess mend ties, relationships. Blowback is caused by, like you said, by the way that they're treating society. So it's always just going to make it worse as it continues to develop.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it goes. I mean, socialism. As a principle, following, for the most part, it sounds fantastic on paper, but when it all comes down to the grit and gritty, nobody's actually going to abide by that. Everybody's an authoritarian in their own right. Everybody's out there for their selfish interests. We're all human beings. I mean, the Bible talks about it. I mean, that's one reason why the Old Testament's filled with just death, despair, and destruction, and an angry God. I mean, evil had to be cleansed. The flood occurred for a reason. I mean, the Nephilim had to be cleansed of the earth. The sin had to be repaired, and then everything had to be restarted again from the sins of Adam. So I mean, that's my take on it, at least. So I mean, so I'm not rambling on. I mean, let's move forward, I guess. So anything to say about that, Alex?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And this is something that a lot of people miss in Genesis, in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, is that in a lot of ways, the Bible is a radical critique of human power, which is what libertarianism is as well. That's why we believe that power exists, but you have to decentralize it and diffuse it as much as possible, or those that have the power will use it to oppress those that don't. And when you go back to the stories in the earliest chapters of Genesis, God creates a good world, and he creates people in his image and likeness, and he gives them dominion over creation. We're supposed to exercise God's rule over creation on his behalf, but there's no need for like a government or a state or anything like that, because God is king in that scenario. You have this good world. God provides everything that we need in the garden, and we are supposed to cultivate that garden, but he gives humanity the choice. He puts one tree in the Garden of Eden and says, this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat from this. And then in Genesis chapter 3, you have the serpent tempting the man and the woman in the garden. And what does the serpent say? No, you should definitely eat it. And if you do, you will be like God. And that is the sin that messes up all of creation. And really the rest of the Bible is a story about how God has to work through his people to undo the sin of the man and the woman in the garden. But people forget that sin is about human beings attempting to be like God. So it's about usurping his power and replacing it with our own. And so like even fundamental to the problem of human sin in the Bible is this idea that human beings should try to be like God. And I can't think of anything that is a more accurate instantiation of that than the state. The idea that a group of human beings have the right and the destiny to control everyone else in society. It seems like it's just taking us back to the garden. And it's an attempt of us as human beings to try to exercise the kind of power and authority that only God is supposed to have.
What's interesting, you say that with the state is, it seems like the more sadistic, almost murder cult of the state that we've definitely seen through the 20th century kind of began it kind of begins with like Aleister Crowley and his dominion on his cultish following. And what it led to, and I think at one point they even misconstrue the story of Genesis. They add a name to God. God is Adonai. Adonai is accordingly the supposed evil one, or we don't necessarily know if he's evil or bad evil, or good evil, neutral, whatnot. But Lucifer is the serpent. Obviously, he's considered the serpent. The serpent is the mimic of Lucifer. Lucifer is considered to be at one point he was the anointed one. He was the illuminated one, God's right-hand man until the fall. But the idea around Aleister Crowley and his Luciferian principles, or I don't even know if you want to call it that, but that's, you're bringing in a mesh of calling what's always been considered an evil, represented by Lucifer, and then bringing in Adonai and this neutral / their version of evil, who just pretty much created man and then said, no, you obey. It's kind of like a reverse psychology, in my opinion. Like Adonai created man to obey Adonai, and that's it. You be good obedient souls, and you get to live a happy, peaceful, mundane life, safe. And then Lucifer comes and says, no, if you eat this fruit, you can measure yourself up to the gods. You can be just as high and mighty. You can have the power. You can have all the knowledge, and you'll be just as free, if not more free, because you'll be more power. You'll be equal to us. And
you'll go woke.
You'll go woke. So, and that's what it sounds like. And then you look into today's the generality of today, and where are we at? We're at this woke mob culture, this cancellation. Everybody's kind of stuck in a web of the science, and then different cultish religious beliefs, mainly statism, and there's just a war between people against people, are pitted together. As David Icke would like to say, it's all reptilian. I agree. I think it might be a little reptilian. Or demonic.
Yeah, and that really is a big difference between, I think, the kind of the woke critical theory mentality and the libertarian mentality. The thing that I appreciate about critical theory is that it is an attempt to analyze how power dynamics work in our society, but I think it's the wrong attempt. So what libertarianism does, as we said before, libertarianism is a critique of human power. We understand that it exists, but we have to limit it. We have to decentralize it. We have to diffuse it to as many people as possible so that one person or one organization cannot exercise too much power in society. Well, the critical theorists have a theory of power where there's always a group of oppressors and there's always a group of people that are oppressed. But the goal of critical theory and the politics that are derived from that critical way of understanding social relationships is not, we need to get rid of the power of the oppressor. It's that we need to take the power away from the oppressor and give it to the oppressed. I don't think that they realize that in the future, that's only going to create the exact same power dynamic, only in reverse. If you take power away from one group of people and give it to another group of people, you haven't solved the problem of dominion over another human being. And I just think the thing that people fundamentally don't think about, and this is why libertarianism is a superior philosophy to the philosophy of critical theory, because it's a philosophy that understands the destructive nature of human power, which is a major theme throughout the Bible as well. That's where I think a lot of these ideas kind of intersect. I think it's really important for people to consider that. And a lot of people in the mainstream just have never tried to think about it in those terms.
Now, when we're talking about oppressed, though, like, what does that even mean in today's world? Like, I mean, who is exactly oppressed? Because oppression, if you want to go further on, is everybody at some point has been oppressed. I mean, you can look in the Bible. I mean, the ancient Hebrews were oppressed multiple times, whether it's when they migrated into Egypt and after generations became the slaves of the Pharaoh, or their captivity and their Assyrian captivity or their Babylonian captivity. I mean, Rome, Greece. I mean, you can go on and on, so forth. I mean, their diaspora by the Romans, where they're just kicked out of the Holy Land. I mean, so like, who exactly are we talking about when we're talking about the critical race theorists? Whom is the oppressed? Who is being oppressed? Who are the oppressed and who are the oppressors? If everybody through history has been oppressed at some time, or another.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely true. And what's funny is, I mean, I know we all come from the same area, but like growing up in Kentucky, one of the social dynamics that's posited by the critical theorists is that there's always a power imbalance between white people and black people, as if white people just intrinsically have all the power in the society and black people don't. But when I was growing up in Kentucky, the majority of the people that I knew that were poor, actually almost everyone that I knew that was poor, was white, because those were the people that were living in my area. And so when people would say that somebody like Barack Obama is being inherently oppressed by some of these poor white people from rural Kentucky, that just does not make any sense. But again, we can't base oppression on these immutable characteristics like color, because it's really about who has access to more power in society. And again, I just don't understand how people can't look at the 8 years that Obama was president and think that the idea that just because someone has a darker pigmented skin, that they are therefore necessarily more oppressed than somebody that has a lighter pigmented skin. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention the fact that they were oppressed by probably the same pigment of skin tone prior to being oppressed by, say, white people, like with the African slave trade. So I mean, it's more of a trade-off. It's sad, and I mean, it's more of a trade-off based in markets, and there are ills, negatives when it comes to market-based economies, and one such was slavery. And I mean, when you have a more powerful tribe, because they're able to meet the white man first, the Portuguese or the British or the Dutch or whomever, and trade with them for guns. Now they're the more powerful tribe. So what do you think they're going to do? They're going to conquer the smaller tribes, and then they're going to kill weaker of the weak. Whoever doesn't get killed in battle, they're going to kidnap, and then they're going to get the white man what they want. I mean, free labor, so that they can traffic and sell as labor across the pond, across the Atlantic, in the New World, or in India, or back to Europe. I mean, and make profit. It's just a never-ending circle. Of course, progressives and socialists would say, well, that's where capitalism, that's where free markets are. That's where we go wrong at. This is why we shouldn't have free markets. So, and I say, no. There's always negatives to every positive. So, I mean, you got to have a counterbalance.
Yeah, I agree. And again, you can't have, and I think a lot of people are just so fundamentally ignorant about economics that they aren't able to make those distinctions. But if you have a society in which there are no property rights, no freedom of speech, and no freedom of association, by default, you cannot have a capitalist system, because capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services between people, requires all of these other prerequisite freedoms in order to function. And this is what Ludwig von Mises talks about a lot in his work. He calls it planning for freedom. What he means by that is not central planning an economy from the top down, but creating a social system that inherently gives people the freedom to be able to make their own choices about production and consumption. And you can't do that without also slavery by default is anti-capitalistic, because you're inherently infringing upon the property rights of somebody else. And the most important property right of all is your right of self-ownership. Like, you own yourself and you own your decisions. And if you enslave somebody, that's not capitalism, because you're not giving them the freedom to make choices about the most fundamental property they own, which is their own body. And a lot of people they don't see it that way.
And then that's I think a lot of the ignorance of economics is just, I mean, the public school system, sadly. I mean, if you sat through an economics class, and I know I had it in 12th grade, I think most people have it in 12th grade. You sit through a basic high school economics class, it's mundane, it's boring. There's not much talking about. I think the biggest thing that we did when I was in high school was we had a stock market project, and that was the extent of economics. Other than that, it was just a glorified shit talk study hall. I mean, and unless we were in a computer lab doing our stock portfolio for the project, that was it. I mean, and there's just no, I mean, it's a lot of economics is also promoted as being a little bit more complex than what it truly is. You have to include all this math and all this empirical thinking and research, and I mean, and people tend to not want to look forward towards something that's more difficult, and to learn and be able to understand, when it's hard to understand because of the macro and the micro and all the algebra and the calculus. And I mean, and in reality, what Mises brings up, and Hazlitt and Rothbard, these are guys that they came on their own, establishing the idea that it's just intrinsically basic. I mean, it's supply and demand, it's human action. And I mean, if we can just teach people to come down to that simple form, then we can maybe advance more further into the larger concept of economics. But as far as like markets and actually doing business, entrepreneurship, it's just as basic as it comes: supply, demand, customer, and human innovation and creation.
Yeah.
Say that again, Andrew. I didn't catch that.
You say customer and I say client, so
client, customer, patient. I mean, same thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, and that's, I mean, you bring up a good point about how the education system doesn't give us the skills that we need to think through this, because when I was in high school, all of the elective classes that I took were social studies elective classes, but I had an opportunity, like you said, to take economics my senior year, but it was billed as a math class in high school, and I didn't really much care for math, so I skipped economics. And it wasn't until I started working on my graduate degree, like 10 years after I graduated from high school, that I took an economics class for the first time. And I remember, like, I'd been in ministry for a long time up to this point, and I was one of those people that was economically ignorant. I worked another full-time job. The ministry was kind of like my part-time gig as a career I was trying to get started. So I worked a full-time job, and I learned a lot about like taxation is harmful to people, and we need people to be responsible for their own decisions. But as a Christian, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I believed in charity. And so I just thought that I thought maybe, we need a little bit of socialism, just based on my complete economic ignorance. I didn't know anything about how capitalism or socialism actually worked, or about those definitions. But I remember just thinking, okay, well, maybe there should be a minimum welfare state, and maybe we need to have the roads and the schools and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was what socialism meant. And I remember going into this economics class and opening the economics textbook and reading the first 2 chapters on scarcity and choice and supply and demand. And that changed everything for me. I was like, these issues are so fundamental They're like so simple, but I never thought about them before. And then I immediately skipped to the back of the book where they had a chapter on capitalism and socialism. And they very simply define capitalism as a system that was decentralized, where economic decisions were made by individuals and where private individuals own the factors of production. And socialism is the exact opposite. All economic decision making is centralized, and the public, aka the government, owns the factors of production. And I was like, wait, I'm actually a capitalist. This makes a lot of sense, And I think that if people were just able to have a taste of those economic systems, and if they were able to kind of accurately assess what those vocabulary terms mean, then I think that would completely change the conversation in this country. But you have these people with 50, 60, 100,000 followers on Twitter that talk about capitalism and socialism all day long, and they don't know what these terms fundamentally mean. And that's sad. That's a shame.
That is sad. I mean, and truth be told, I mean, when it comes to capitalism, realistically, like we shouldn't be bragging about capitalism anyways, because I come from a perspective of the realistic perspective is capitalism was never really a term until Karl Marx came about, Engels and Marx. So they kind of coined it, and in reality, like most of the schools of capitalism, you can kind of understand where the socialist perspective for capitalism is coming at them, and a little intervention from government here and a little bit of centralization, I mean, there. And I mean, for the most part, the Federal Reserve, I mean, usury is, you could say, is capitalist. I mean, so I like calling it free markets, or being more agoristic on the approach. But for the simple terms of like not going back and forth and confusing people, I just say capitalism, because it's like, why not? Like, call it capitalism. It's capitalism, socialism, whatever. So, but yeah, that's exactly what it is. Like capitalism, I mean, I think every human being as an individual is capitalistic or free marketeer in some capacity, because we're always hustling for something. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, trying to grow.
Mm-hmm. So, but one thing I will have to say, and I gotta get into the Bible on this, and it comes to taxation. What does everybody has this question, and every Christian is, progressive, conservative, libertarian, doesn't matter. They're always on the fence on the argument of what Jesus meant for the render unto Caesar verse. What does he mean from
that is a really, really challenging question, and if I ever find out exactly what he means, I'll be the first to let you know. I think that there are definitely some considerations that we have to make here, and I'm opening my Bible to that passage there, because there's a lot going on in that tradition that I think people do not recognize, and I think that we need to make some very important distinctions. So here, let me make sure I got, yes. All right, so the first occurrence, so the Gospel of Mark is probably historically the first of the four Gospels to be written. And so the first tradition where this statement was recorded was in Mark chapter 12. And the passage says it's the Passover the week before he dies, and he's in Jerusalem, and he is in a conflict with the leaders of Jerusalem, the leaders of the Jewish people, and then the political authorities as well. And there's really no difference between the political and religious authorities back then. There were some different offices, but they would not have separated out political and religious leadership in the way that we do in the modern world. But this is how that passage goes. It says, then they, the leaders, sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to trap Jesus in a statement. And they came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or not?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why are you testing me? Bring me your denarius to look at." They brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." And they were amazed at him. Now, this is in in all three of the Gospels, or all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is a part of a tradition that includes other conflicts with the leaders of Jesus's day. And so this isn't transmitted in isolation. So in other words, Jesus has another battle with the Sadducees over the resurrection. He has another battle with some scribes over what is the most important of all the teachings in the law. And so we have to understand that in that context. And this passage comes right after Jesus has this parable where he talks about how God is going to destroy Jerusalem because of their corruption and their wickedness. And I think that one of the ironies of this text is that when the Pharisees come to Jesus, these are good Jews, people that are not supposed to worship the pagan gods, people that are not supposed to put their faith in Caesar. Jesus says, whose inscription is on the coin? And then who is the one that produces a coin with the blasphemous picture of Caesar on it? It's the Pharisees. So the Pharisees have this coin in their pocket with an image of Caesar on it. And Jesus says, I got you. You're being hypocritical. And he says, whose image is that? And he says, render unto Caesar. I think that Jesus is diffusing that statement. And I think that Jesus is trying to demonstrate that the Pharisees are not concerned about whether or not Jesus is a good law-abiding Jew. They're trying to trap him because of their own self-interest. And this is one of the things that I think people need to be very careful of when they're reading the Bible. Just because the Bible in a place like this deals with the issue of taxation does not mean that the writers of the Bible are trying to give us a timeless theory or theology about the purpose and the example of taxation. So, for instance, just because Jesus is mentioning that there is a conversation here, just because Mark is mentioning that there is a conversation here going on about the poll tax, Mark is not taking a stand on whether or not taxation is theft, because that's not the purpose of this passage. The purpose of this passage is to demonstrate that Jesus is outsmarting the leaders of his day that want to crucify him. That's the overall message. That's the overall theme of this passage. And so we don't want to extrapolate from that a timeless theory of taxation, because that's not the point of this passage. So I don't think that this passage in particular has anything to do with whether or not we as Christians, in other words, it doesn't legitimize taxation any more than it critiques having coins that have pictures of leaders on them. That's not the purpose of the passage. The purpose is to show that Jesus is superior to the Jewish leaders, and that the punishment that God is going to bring on them is inherently just. That's, I think, what Jesus is getting at here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, that would make more sense than the taxation aspect, because what is it? The 10 Commandments, the first commandment, or wait, is it the first or the third? But anyways, thou shalt not have other gods or worship other gods before me, and that would be idolatry. To have the face of Caesar on your coin, I mean, that would go against the Jewish faith for the Pharisees. To the fact that their own self-interest is to enrich themselves with coinage of what is effectively a Roman dinar. They're enriching themselves. So, and then that coin has the face of Caesar Augustus on it. And at that point, I mean, he wasn't really a deity, but he was essentially worshipped as if he were a deity, being Caesar of Rome, Emperor of Rome. So, I mean, that's idolatry. So that would be breaking the commandment of worshiping other gods before the one true God. So, I mean, it is. I mean, it's more challenging the hypocrisy of the Pharisees rather than saying taxation is theft or just. I mean, it's more just toying with the hypocrites that the Pharisees have become over the years of Rome being in Judea.
Yeah, and I think that this would be to make if I was to turn this into a modern parallel, I think that this would be akin to if Jesus was to go to a modern American church where the people that were at that church said, "We believe that Jesus is Lord," and then at the end of the service they stood up and said the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Well, you can't have both of those things, right? And it's obviously a double standard. Now, if Jesus was to criticize the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, this doesn't mean that Jesus is making a timeless statement about the nature of government or any of those kind of things. He would be telling the Christians, what you're doing is hypocritical, because you say that you say that I am your king, but then you also pledge allegiance to this state. And I think that there's a very similar point being made here. Jesus is not talking about a theory of taxation. Jesus is simply saying your guys' priorities are not right, and you need to deal with that issue from the heart. There has been a lot of historical research done on this passage. And again, there is no academic consensus as to what Jesus means here. The biblical scholars are completely divided, but there has been some good research done into the way that coins were minted during this period. And there are some scholars that think that the Jewish temple minted coins or had coins minted for them that depicted pictures of plants and other things like that, and that would have been the customary currency that Jews would have used when they went and bought offerings and sacrifices and spent money at the temple. And so the fact that these Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the Herodians, don't have these other coins but have coins with the inscription of Caesar is that is the problem itself.
And then I mean, speaking of like the difference between, like, say, the minting of the dinar and then the minting of the different coins used without the face of, say, people and plants and all that for temple purchase.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense from when Jesus goes in to the temple and throws his tantrum and throws all the money changers out of the temple and destroys and wreaks havoc, essentially putting his fate, like, pretty much. But it kind of makes sense of why he goes in there, because they're exchanging these goods in the temple at this point, most certainly in Roman dinars, because this is a Roman province, and Rome is becoming much more of a greater influence, specifically with their puppet kings that they've held for the last few generations in Judea. So, I mean, now it makes sense, like, from that passage, the render unto Caesar passage, and then the theater in the temple of the throwing out of the money changers, kind of makes sense of what Jesus's mindset is, and the idolatry and the disrespect to God factor, and going against the faith more so than taxation and usury and all this and that. That's a totally different concept and a different argument for another day that we'll probably continue to have. So
yeah, and I do think too, this is where people automatically assume that the ancients had to think in the same categories that we did. But when people living in the first century thought about economics, and they thought about empire, and they thought about taxation, their categories for thinking about those are just completely different than our own. And so we shouldn't assume that just because they seem to be dealing with an issue that is very important to us in the 21st century, that they necessarily thought about it in the same way that we do in the modern world. And I think a lot of people make these historical category mistakes. So, for instance, in antiquity, there was no industrialized economy because they didn't have steam powered or electric industry. So their entire economy was a lot different. The assumptions that they made about the economy was a lot different. The path to wealth and what wealthy people should do was much different than it was in the modern world. And I think that we jump back into antiquity and take all of our modern ideas with us without realizing that they just wouldn't have thought that way. And in a lot of ways, we cannot draw easy parallels between what happened in the first century and what happened in the 21st century. I think that we can get principles from a lot of these texts in the Bible. And so a great principle that arises out of Mark chapter 12 here is that our ultimate loyalty should be towards God. That's the principle. But I don't think that we can draw any further detailed conclusions about how we need to structure a modern economy or think about taxation in the modern sense from this passage, because that was not what it was intending to communicate to its original audience. That's not the purpose of the passage, and we shouldn't try to fit it into any sort of schema that it was not ever intended to address.
Fantastic. And then I think that's a great part to transition, I mean, towards because I like the aspect that you brought about the ancients thought a different way, and that's one reason why they were less industrious than we are today, is because of the lack of technological innovations that they had then, that they didn't have then, that we have now. And I think that's a brilliant way of bringing Andrew into this conversation, because and get started on this Exodus, idea of what Exodus can provide for us on not only a Christian standard but on a libertarian standard. So, Andrew, you wanna jump in on this?
Well, I mean, you think about, if you go back and read the Bible, they talk about how narrow-minded the Pharaoh was, and how it really took a lot of effort for to be impressed upon him um that he's got it, and he's not in a right in the way he was presenting towards his population, and how he was supporting more sorry the way he was presenting was kind of narrow-minded, and that there are different perspectives on how society could be run, and they wanted that freedom, but they couldn't. It just took a lot of effort to push him to let them go and be independent. So,
and I got a question for both of y'all. How is it that, because I know as we're winding down Genesis and we have the story of Joseph and well, Jacob's sons, and the story of Joseph being duped by his brothers, his jealous brothers, that sell him into slavery, and he winds up in Egypt, and turns out he ends up being favored by Pharaoh and given a very esteemed position. And when famine comes to I guess it was called Canaan then, but to the land of Canaan, and the brothers and their families are forced to migrate to Egypt, and that's how Joseph is able to bring them in. How do we go from migration because of famine, and the permission of being able to come into Egypt, settle, and start a new life in order to survive, to the aspect of the Hebrews being slaves? So how do we go from migratory immigration towards slavery?
Yeah, what do you think, Andrew?
I mean, things settle as society develops and people get complacent. So that wouldn't be surprising to me. It takes once people get comfortable, it's really hard to get get into a new groove. There's a lot of confluence, a lot of pressure to continue the system that's been developed.
That's fair. So what you're saying is, like, the complacency and the comfort mentality of one party, or of a people, of a certain group, it causes them to kind of get so thrust into the society that they have become accustomed to, that they end up forgetting their own customs, their own culture, and then they're absorbed. But yet, because they've absorbed themselves into another culture, they've assimilated, generations down the road, you gotta decipher, okay, who's the pure blood and who's the imposter. And it sounds like that. Yeah, go on.
Just who's, like you said, who's who, and the support is basically the lower class.
Yeah.
So do you think that's a fair assessment?
No. I mean that is maybe one of the greatest themes of the Old Testament, is that Abraham's family, God's people, is supposed to remain distinct from the nations that are around them. That's why God gave them the law. It was so that they could be holy or separate from the nations around them. Because again, if you go back to with Exodus, we understand that, like, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, were originally composed as one literary word that fit on 5 different scrolls. So all 5 of those books are one continuous narrative, and they're designed to be read together. So themes that are present at the earliest chapters of Genesis run their way throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. And so again, you have, going back to Genesis chapter 3, the fall of man into sin, and then you have the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah and the flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel, demonstrating that human beings, when they grasp for power on their own, only make God's good creation worse and worse. And what does God do to solve that problem? In Genesis chapter 12, he calls Abraham and promises him a family, and ultimately God will rule over the world again through Abraham's family. But all throughout Genesis, there are these situations in which it seems like Abraham's family is going to be extinct, or like you were saying, they're going to be assimilated into the nations that are around them. So they get into Exodus, and I think you guys set this up perfectly. There are two combinations. They became, like Andrew said, complacent in their position in Egypt. They were so connected to that Egyptian culture that they didn't want to fight for it. And then on the flip side of that, you have a new Pharaoh that comes to power in Exodus chapter 1, and that Pharaoh, it feels like he's threatened by the power and the prestige of the Hebrew people. So what does he do? He enslaves them so that they're not a threat to his power. And this is what makes Moses so frustrated. The Hebrews aren't willing to fight back for their freedom, even though God called them to be distinct, and he made all these promises for them to be separate from the nations and to be a light to the nations. They're not willing to fight for that, even in the earliest chapters of the book of Exodus. And this is going to create a set of problems that are going to be carried out throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. So I think you guys hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's that combination of complacency and not realizing that as God's people, they were supposed to be set apart from the Egyptians.
It's kind of like how Shane Falco in The Replacements, when he's asked what his greatest fear is, and he says quicksand. Quicksand. So I mean, the fact that the scary aspect of life, not knowing your future, not knowing what to expect, it drags you down very slowly, like quicksand. So I mean, and that's sort of what we're kind of watching, and as we read through Exodus, especially the earlier passages before Moses becomes well known as the leader, the new father of the Israelite nation. You're watching the fear of not wanting to give an inch. So like, well, if we stop working, then I don't have a home, or they might murder my firstborn son or whatever. I mean, so all that fear going through of not knowing what to expect if they just fight, just lay down their tools and pick up or better yet, turn their tools into weapons upon the Egyptians and fight for their right to their own self-ownership, their own bodies. I mean, and to free themselves. Instead, they take the beating, and they just go on about their business, and they're compliant for comfort. I mean, if they're not compliant, they're not comfortable.
Yeah, and I think one of the really frustrating aspects of Exodus is that God goes through this massive process where he calls Moses and Aaron to be a representative for God and his people before Pharaoh. And eventually God delivers them through the, you have Passover, and then you have God delivering through the Red Sea, and he makes all these promises to Israel in the wilderness. But no sooner have the waters of the Red Sea receded back to their level, killing all of Pharaoh's army, then what do the Israelites do? They complain that it's hard in the desert, and they beg to go back to Egypt. It's like God just rescued you from years of brutal slavery, and you're upset that he's not going to be able to provide you with food and water, and you want to go back to the Egyptians. So I also think too, I mean, there's something that the idea, and again, Israel struggles with this and ultimately fails because throughout the Old Testament, they're not able to maintain that distinction. So Exodus introduces this theme of Israel wanting to reject its God-given call and instead be like the nations that surround them. So I think that there's that aspect of it too. But then I think, like, even for Christians today, I think kind of a good principle that we can draw from that is that we shouldn't want to be we shouldn't want to look like the people that are around us or think like the people that are around us. Like, we have to have a completely different way of understanding the world and of orienting our values. And the Israelites just completely failed to do that. Even after they saw God deliver them and destroy the army of the Pharaoh, and they saw all the plagues and everything, their response was, we don't like what God has done. We want to go back to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us are like that in our person. I think a lot of us, the God comes and does something powerful in our life, and we're like, that was really great for a time. I think I want to go back to doing the things that I was doing before,
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, but that's the human. But I think we can sympathize with the Hebrews because that's the human condition. I think that's part of what Exodus is trying to tell us, that human beings, when they try to follow their own path and be like God, will ultimately only wind up becoming like the idols that they
Mm-hmm.
worship.
And then it leads on to, like, say 1 Samuel when when they vie for a king, just like to be just like every other nation around them, as you said. I mean, that's taking a step backwards. I mean, you're trying to be distinct, and yet you want a king. Well, okay, well, let them have a king. What happens there? I mean, they got a king, and they had excess war, and they were stolen from, and that takes it back to the libertarian standard and to society today. I mean, for us as individuals, we want to own ourselves, we want to govern ourselves, we want to maintain our own responsibility, and we want to be free. But then at the same time, we're so comfortable that we think we still need a leader that needs to protect us from ourselves while we're being free to do our own thing. So, and that's the conundrum that we see from the Bible to throughout the rest of history to now, is, I mean, just the struggle to find what you yourself can maintain, but then you're outsourcing authority to someone else. And if you go to the Bible, the only authority that there should be besides your own is God's. I mean, no other man. Man can't rule over man. Only God can rule man.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look, like, the greatest passage for this in the entire Old Testament is 1 Samuel 8, where Israel goes to the prophet Samuel and says, hey, we really want a king so that we can be like the nations that surround God. And what does God say to Samuel? Hey, don't feel bad for yourself. They're not really rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king, because God is supposed to be king over the family of Abraham. And then it's exactly like you said, Zach. If you read 1 Samuel 8, what does God say? If you get a king, they're going to tax you and they're going to send your children to die in wars. That's what it looks like to be a part of the nations that are surrounding you. And that's exactly what happens. The rest of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, which recounts the history of Israel up until the Babylonian exile, is a story of Israel trying to be like the nations, and them falling and suffering and struggling, and then begging God for forgiveness, and then going back and doing the same thing over again, because that's what it means to reject God as a king. And you're going to give yourself over to terrestrial powers who are only self-interested and only going to use their power to benefit themselves. It's just, again, it's a return to Genesis chapter 3. And there's no way out of that cycle until you realize that God is king and you submit to that. It's the only way that you can possibly break that spell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that it kind of makes me kind of giddy a little bit when you're looking through and you go in the, say, Judges, and you read through Judges, and you kind of experience the notion that this is kind of quasi-anarchic. I mean, it's more tribal. It's literally the tribes ruling themselves. Yeah, they have conflict with the Philistines. I mean, but it's not to the extent. The extent of that conflict doesn't fruition into something more grandeur and more violent and bloody until they get their king, till the Israelites get their king. But I mean, but they trade with one another. They have their issues, but I mean, everybody has their issues. For the most part, it's not chaotic. It's just life is good for the most part, for what it can be good. And then they finally get their king after in Samuel, and then you start seeing the wars. You start seeing the dire consequences of going up against the might of the Philistines, the next door neighbor, and you just and then you see even more of a ripple effect between the tribes as well. In fact, they split. I mean, you have Israel and Judah that are formed, So they can't even agree on who the king should be, just like any other nation.
Yep.
So, I mean, I think you hit it right there. It's like we're all anarchic beings, but there is a king. The king is just not of this world. So why not embrace a little anarchy in this world and understand that the only king to submit to is God.
Yeah, and this is the really important aspect of Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God and the Christian belief that Jesus is the true king. You have passages like in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul says that Christians need to have the same attitude that Jesus had. And he goes on to say that even though Jesus existed in the form of God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be held on to, but instead he became a servant by becoming a man and then by dying a death on the cross. But then Paul ends that section by saying, and it's because of this that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. So the theme there is that the true path to power, what power actually looks like, is being willing to sacrifice and die for other people. That's what it really looks like. And so Jesus's example is what it looks like to be a true human being that exercises power. It's a power that's shaped like the cross. It means that Christians have an obligation to sacrifice for each other, and true power and true leadership is found in that practice and that principle. And we call it, in New Testament scholarship, it's called cruciformity. It's the idea that Christians, when they think about power and when they think about how they ought to treat other people, all of our conceptions of our moral behavior have to be conformed to the cross. Because when Jesus dies as the king on the cross, he's demonstrating to us that this is what it means to be the king. It means you make sacrifices for other people instead of demanding that they make sacrifices for you. And if you look at like the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus in the New Testament, and then the book of James, they outline what it means to be a Christian leader. So if you're going to be a leader in one of these early Jesus believing communities, you have to abide by these principles. And these principles are all, you have to make sacrifices. You have to make sure that you're consistent. You have to make sure that you're working hard for the benefit of other people. And if you don't do that, you can't be a leader, because Christian leadership and every Christian philosophy of power should always go back to the cross, because that's where God revealed what true power is. It's through sacrifice for other people, not through power and domination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, then we have evangelicals. What is wrong with evangelicals?
Oh man. I mean, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. What in the world do you think has happened over the last? I have some theories there, but I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Over the last 40 years, what has gone wrong with American Protestantism?
Andrew, you got anything to say on that?
I mean, trying to refine society. It's a double-edged sword. It's good in some ways and it's destructive in others. It just depends on how the people want to use that for their advantage. A lot of it's very politically advantageous to call out people and say that's not right. I need that, and they just use that as an excuse so they can gain power and move up the card.
Yeah. I mean, and to add on, I mean, I think that the issue with evangelicalism and just Protestantism in general here in this country is I think it stems from, in my opinion, it stems from post-Civil War, and the embrace of a more nationalized sense of patriotic duty since the consolidation of federal power and the failure of succession and simple peaceful divorce because there was a disagreement between the North and the South. Actually, we could go even further because Illinois actually almost succeeded as well. New York City almost succeeded as an independent city state. I mean, because they didn't want to lose their free trade with King Cotton South. But I mean, it goes with that. It also goes with I think the South and still is really was a stronger beacon of that Christian Protestantism. Rather than the North, which I think in the North predominantly you had more of this social structure of the New Age spiritualism that was coming about. That was more. I guess it had more of a sense of, well, the New Age movement of today for the most part, where so you kind of had the North and the South fighting on a spiritual level, as well as a political level, as well as an institutional level, an economic level. But then you also had the progressive movement, and the labor wars. And it became more modern. So by the time Christianity comes back in fold in the United States, like tenfold, it's kind of been poisoned a little bit. It's kind of more like we got to align ourselves politically in order to get back into an influence. So without going on a tangent and rambling onto nothing, I'm just gonna say it got too political.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. One of the things that I think Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises emphasized in their work that very few other people have noticed is that almost all of the early progressives were Christian, and and the reason why they were progressives is they believed in this idea called postmillennialism, which is this reading of the book of Revelation and other quote unquote prophetic. I think it's a misreading, but it's a reading of certain texts in the New Testament that they think refer what's going to happen in the future. And in postmillennialism, they believe that there has to be 1,000-year reign of peace on the earth before Jesus can come back. So the idea is that if you can use these new progressive socialist ideas to usher in this 1,000-year reign of peace on the earth, then we can trigger the return of Christ. So a lot of the early progressives were Christians who wanted to enact this through progressive policies. And as you said before, it's during this time that the United States like the federal government, was rapidly expanding. And throughout the 20th century, the size of the government continued to grow and grow and grow to where there was more up for grabs than ever before. And I think you're right. For a long time, evangelicals in the United States didn't really have a political home. There were some that were progressive, there were some that were conservative, but there was no united evangelical voting bloc. And I think the Republicans in the late 1970s were able to figure out that the evangelical community was a massive group of politically homeless Americans. And so with the Ronald Reagan administration, they deliberately tailored a lot of their message and their agenda to try to reach that voting bloc. And it was successful. And so I think since the 1980s on, there's been this connection or relationship between political conservatism and evangelicalism that didn't really exist until before 1980. And this also goes back to like the whole Lord of the Rings paradox, where in the Lord of the Rings, there's that very famous scene where Boromir, whoever it is holding the ring, and he says, well, why can't we use this for good? But the problem is you can't use it for good because the ring corrupts everyone that touches it. And Tolkien was an anarchist. The ring is a symbol of power. And I think the problem with American evangelicalism is that once they got a taste for power, that by definition is going to corrupt their witness and mission to the world, because as Christians, we're supposed to be representing Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah. That should be our North Star. But instead, we'd rather grab the reins of political power and use it to impose our vision of reality on other people, making us no different than the people that we are supposed to criticize. And so I think you have all those factors coming together there in the 1980s, and we're just living with the reality of that. And unfortunately, the church has been so stupid and so foolish in the way that they have used that power to oppress people that are different than them, that they've lost a lot of their credibility. And I think in the long run, this is going to be incredibly bad for the American church.
Yeah, I mean, I like the fact that you mentioned that is like the church, no matter what institution it is, whatever denomination, I mean, it seems like they fall into line with whatever the power structure is in order to keep itself afloat. Like the Catholic Church, I mean, we all know they're not their allegiance, but at least their blind eye that they had with the Nazis and fascist Italy in the 30s and the 40s, especially at the height of the Holocaust. I mean, same with the evangelicals. They're trying to hold a politically homeless sect of Christians in America finally found a home within the Republican Party. And then in effect, when it comes to that, the Republican Party also found a new hope, because the Republican Party had been dying probably since, God, the 1930s. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the true progressives. I mean, the socialist Republicans, born out of socialist thought in 1854, and the party of Lincoln, celebrated by the Soviet Union, by the way, in the rallies. Lincoln.
A lot of American GOP members don't like to admit that.
No, but that's where the Republican Party kind of lost its luster, was TR split in 1912, when he went on his own thing with the Bull Moose, and the Democrats kind of they hijacked the progressive movement, understanding, hey, this is here, we can use this. And then they wielded the power of the institutional structures that were put in place, that the Republicans and the Democrats are still at a tit for tat even to this day. Republicans build the structure, Democrats wield the power. And I think that's where the evangelicals come in, is like, they needed a home, Republicans needed attachment to kind of have influence. And on top of that, most of the evangelicals were predominantly in the old Democrat South, as the Democrats were becoming more progressive. And so they took that. So they kind of helped each other. They molded a relationship of power and influence to kind of give themselves a chance, at least temporarily. Now, I think that temporary chance that is long gone. I think we'll probably see the Republican Party finally collapse in the upcoming years. They may not. They might be too uniparty that they might keep them. But I mean, yeah. But that's where I see it. Is, I mean, it was a kind of a way for the Republican Party to stay in reach, and then this Christian sect that nobody really hears about finally having some sort of say.
Yeah. And it's, for me, like, I don't know. The reason why I'm a libertarian, I tell people this all the time, but the reason why I'm a libertarian is because I'm a Christian first. Like, that was my first commitment. And I remember when I became a Christian in high school and started reading the Bible, one of the themes that stood out to me the most in the New Testament was the idea that people had to choose this faith for themselves. You cannot impose it on other people. And there are eternal consequences for making the wrong choice. But at the end of the day, I have my faith, and my responsibility was not to force somebody else to believe in Jesus or to force them to live by the values that arose from my faith, but to try to peacefully convince them through spreading the gospel and by being an example through the way that I live my life. And so as I got older, I kind of just took that basic notion and applied it to politics. Why do we have to have a system where one side has to impose their will on somebody else through force? Shouldn't we just have a completely free system where people are free to live what they want, and then allow all these ideas to compete in the marketplace? Because I believe that the gospel is just as good, better even, than any other worldview that's available out there. And so if we had a truly free society where people are allowed to freely express themselves and then live by the values that arise out of their worldview, we'd be in a much better place to spread the gospel than doing exactly what the evangelicals did, grasping for political power and trying to dominate other people through political power. That's exactly what the Christian nationalists are trying to do right now. Mm-hmm. It's never worked for the evangelicals, and it never will work in a million years, because, and this is the thing the Republicans and the Democrats just can't understand. When you try to impose your worldview on society through force, there will always be a reaction, and that reaction will always be worse than the thing that you were initially responding to. And I think this is why we have these cycles where you have a Democrat administration for 8 years. Everyone gets pissed off about all of the terrible decisions they make. So then there's this right-wing reaction that's just as authoritarian. They wind up failing because they piss everybody off on the other side. And we have this cycle where none of these problems are ever actually addressed or solved. It's just people grasping for power to try to wield it against other people, to force them to live by values that they don't have. And I think that is the fundamental problem. And as Christians, if we believe that Jesus is king, we have to reject that outright. We have to advocate for a society where people can freely share ideas and where people don't exercise arbitrary power and dominion over others.
I mean, it could be worse we could have two geriatrics vying for the presidential election. I mean, oh wait.
Yep.
So,
Every race is in the nursing home.
Right.
that's pretty sad where we're at right now. I mean, the fact that the aspect of the system we built has conjured up Donald Trump and Joe Biden for president. I mean, I guess we have Nikki Haley now. I mean, she might beat Trump, but
Oh,
I
neocon
doubt
Nikki.
it.
I tell you, if I was a little kid in the Middle East right now, I'd be afraid.
I'd say, come on, Israel, finish up, get it done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sadly, I mean, I hate for everything that's going on, especially now, and especially what more chaos has occurred in Israel and Gaza and all that. Like, I mean, it's just a never-ending consequence. And I guess we could turn towards the Bible on that aspect too, because why is it that it seems like there's an eternal struggle for this little strip of land from once known as the land of milk and honey, Canaan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the current iteration of the violence that we're experiencing in the Middle East goes back really just to the end of the 19th century with the rise of modern Zionism. I think that that's at the root of a lot of the conflicts going on in the Middle East. And I think, again, after World War I, imposing like the imperial powers kind of carving up the Middle East and imposing their mandates on particular parts of the Middle East and forcing people to live where they didn't want to and all that. And then, of course, you have the establishment of the nation state of Israel after World War II, which was kind of like the crown jewel of the Zionist project. But up until that point, Jews and Christians and Muslims were able to coexist relatively peacefully in the Middle East. With the meddling of the Western superpowers in the late 19th and early 20th century, that created a lot of the conflict that we see in the Middle East today. I think a lot of people go back and anachronistically read prophecies from the Bible into what's currently happening in the Middle East. But I think that there's a completely non-theological answer to that question. It's just simply that imperial powers went messing and meddling in territories that they had no business being a part of. And it's the idea, kind of what you were saying, Andrew, earlier with blowback. It's we go over there, and this is the inevitable consequence of years of foreign policy failures in the Middle East. We should have a foreign policy in the Middle East, thousands of miles away from the United States, of no strategic threat to us whatsoever. Yes, they have lots of oil, which is the real reason why we all know we're over in the Middle East. It has to do with that, and in imperial designs and all of those kinds of things. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it wasn't historically inevitable. I do think that there's a really interesting parallel, and there's an excellent book called The First Crusade and the Quest for the Apocalypse by a Jewish scholar named J. Rubenstein. And he goes back to the 11th century with the establishment under Pope Urban II in 1094 and 1095 of the First Crusades. And one of the points that he makes in that book is that you were at the end of the first Christian millennium, and throughout Europe at this time, there was kind of this great apocalyptic expectation that Jesus was going to come back and that this was going to be the end of world. This was going to be the end of history as you know it. That God was going to come back and resolve all the problems in history and bring it to its intended conclusion. And so Pope Urban II was able to capitalize on that millenarian expectation and say, hey, if we go over and conquer the Holy Land, again, it's kind of like the postmillennialist progressive Christians in the late 19th century. If we go over and conquer the Holy Land, then we can trigger the return of Jesus and he'll come back and we'll bring about the end history. So there's that theological aspect to it. Even going back to the Crusades, you have the fact that pilgrims had always been able to travel to the Holy Land since the Muslims conquered it in the 7th century, and a new group of Muslims came into town and conquered Jerusalem and kicked all the Seljuk Turks, and they were violent towards other Muslims. A lot of other Muslim groups did not like the Seljuk Turks, and they refused to allow Christians to go on their pilgrimage. So it's not just that there's theological reasons for these conflicts in the Middle East. A lot of them come down to economics and power politics as well. And I think that we have a tendency, because there's kind of this aura around Israel as it being like the chosen nation. There's no connection between the modern nation state of Israel and historic Jewish people. And in fact, many Jews around the world reject the idea of Zionism. Like there's a large strain of Jewish thought that is completely against the Zionist movement. And I think that it just goes to show you that these conflicts that recur throughout history in the Middle East have a lot less to do with what we see in the Old Testament and a lot more to do with empire building and economics and using people's gullible theologically shallow ideas in order to convince them to go and fight for things that have nothing to do with the Bible or with Jesus or any of that. I think the most brilliant aspect of the Zionist Jewish lobby in the United States is convincing evangelical Christians that by giving money and political support to Israel, they can bring about the return of Jesus. Like Benjamin Netanyahu is a genius for being able to convince these people that that is the case, despite the fact that there is no biblical evidence for that whatsoever. It's just the whole thing doesn't make any sense. But again, we know because we've read Scott Horton and all of that, we know that this is just in the 21st century about the American empire. And that's the reason for all these conflicts overseas. And if we just came home and stopped funding these conflicts, they'd find ways to figure out those problems.
Yeah. I mean, I find it quite interesting with the now the American empire. We kind of took over the British, but at one point, while they were trying to figure out the Jewish question and with the Palestinian mandate, the Jewish and the Arab question with Britain and France with the Balfour Agreement, which the infamous Rothschilds were a big part of, the banking family. So, but I mean, a lot of the main leaders of the Arabs actually wanted to do business with. They wouldn't talk to anybody. They wanted to conduct business with the United States and only the United States. They wanted the United States say in it because at that point we were the ones that were like, we were the isolationists, we were the non-interventionists. They knew that the United States weren't going to come and encroach on their culture, their land, their space. They weren't going to interfere with their needs. So they wanted the United States to come in and be that arbiter, rather than Britain or France or the League of Nations or whatnot. And now you see that you see it tilt, and we're now exactly what we were against not even that long ago. I mean, literally just a century ago. The exact opposite than what we are now. And I find that fascinating for what we kind of took the torch for just because of the events of World War II, and essentially the fall of Great Britain. We kind of just took the torch and became the monster that we were inevitably against.
Yeah, and the thing that is the most frustrating about that is it didn't have to be that way. I think that after World War II, had we realized that like nation building and radical progressivism and socialism and all that stuff does not work. Just look at Europe. It obviously in 1945, it obviously does not work. Had we had political leaders, had it not been Harry Truman and some of the other people that were in power at that time, that actually had a sense of American civic virtue, that we believe in the values of America, we believe in freedom, we believe in free association, we believe in free markets. This is what we believe as a country, and we're not going to do this European stuff anymore. Had we just ended it all and just said, it's over, we're not going to build out an empire, communism would have collapsed on its own accord. It does not work. We know that it does not work. We did not need to build up a giant military industrial complex and further enlarge the size of the state in order to fight communism, because we all knew that that was going to be an experiment that would never make it in the real world. But instead, we propped up communist regimes around the world for decades because we just continued to intervene in places around the world where we had absolutely no business being. Who cares if Vietnam becomes a communist country? It's not going to work for them. Eventually the people get sick and tired of it and they'll rise up and overthrow their own leaders. We don't have to get involved in that. it was not a threat to us. But instead, we built up this massive military apparatus, and we built up all of these state institutions to try to protect us from the communists. And that leads directly into the war on terror and the current crises that we're in right now. And had we just as a country had the wherewithal to say, you know what, we're going to be the shining city on a hill, we're going to be the beacon of liberty for the rest of the world, we're not doing this stuff anymore, the Europeans they screwed it all up, we could have stopped all of this from happening. But instead, after World War II, the lesson wasn't we shouldn't be like the Europeans. The lesson was we need to do exactly what the Europeans did, only we're going to do it better this time because we're bigger and stronger, and the rest of the world was destroyed by World War II. And that has led to all of the dysfunction that we see in our society today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's sad. It really, there's nothing else to say. And true, and the part of the communism going to collapse, the Soviet Union did. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed probably about the time the Berlin Wall was built. In fact, that was the reason why the wall was built, because they were losing so many people across the Soviet Union into Germany, into West Germany, and as well as Berlin too. Like, I mean, a lot of people don't realize there was a wall across Germany. Berlin was in East Germany, but yeah, they were losing so many people that they were people of resources. They were collapsing, so they needed a wall. Trump's big wall,
the best wall.
The best big, glorious, beautiful wall. China has one, believe me.
Donald Trump's wall would win. I mean, but I mean, as soon as they implemented that, that's when it kind of propped them up just for a few more years. But I mean, inevitably, the United States, sadly to say, the United States was funding the Soviet Union to stay kind of elevated. So we had an enemy until finally it came crashing to a halt in 1991. So we were actually trying to figure out how we can keep it from going into disarray as well. Like in 91, when they were in their in-between phase, and the Soviets were trying to maintain power. They were holding their first elections, and so we were trying to we influenced even the Soviet Union from not collapsing, and it inevitably collapsed on its own. It collapsed because communism is a failure, and even the United States was propping up the communists of the Soviet Union to incentivize an enemy, to manufacture an enemy. Of course, now you wonder why. Now everybody wonders why the war on terror had to occur and manufacture an enemy.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's that, like, you think about organizations like NATO were designed with the specific purpose of checking communism. They were going to be a Western check on the spread of communism in the East. That was the purpose of it. And that was also the stated purpose of the buildup of the United States military apparatus after World War II. This is exactly what Eisenhower talked about in his farewell address when he described what was happening as the military industrial complex. And so we make it to the end of the Cold War, and for 40 years, these giant military expenditures and our participation in an organization like NATO at least had the pretext of us being able to say we have this massive enemy called communism in the East, and we have to have all of these institutions in place because they could attack us at whatever time they wanted. So the logical conclusion of that is that if the Soviet Union and communism were the great enemies, well, in 1991, we won that war. The war is over. That means we don't need NATO anymore. That means we don't need the world's largest military and the history of the human race by factors of 100. We don't need any of that stuff anymore. We won the war. Let's come home. But there were thousands of people that were making lots and lots of money off the Cold War. And so what did we do? We had to go and immediately get ourselves entangled in Middle Eastern affairs. And of course, that started before the end of the Cold War too. That goes back to the late 1970s. And really, I think it goes back to Nixon getting us off the gold dollar and us having to build out the petrodollar in order to have something to back our currency. There's a whole complicated history back there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in 1991, we had another chance for peace. We could have said we're done, but there were too many rich and powerful people that were making millions and millions and billions off of these wars for us to wrap it up. So we just went and found new wars to fight, and that's what we've been doing ever since. Again, like all, the $200 billion in aid that we've given Ukraine over the last couple of years was not aid to the Ukrainian. It was money that was given to companies like Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin that produce weapons that they then sell to these countries. There's no aid about it at all. We just perpetuated a war in which hundreds of thousands of completely innocent people died, in which no one had any business fighting to begin with. And it's all just so sad to see that, and to see how many evangelical Christians will line up behind every single new war initiative in the United States, as if that's just okay, as followers of Christ.
Yeah, followers of Christ, but support war. I mean,
yeah. Talk about a double standard.
Terms.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting times on that. To be a Christian, you got to support war, and you got to be pro-Israel. I mean,
yeah.
Wild.
Yeah,
why not be pro-human being? So I mean,
yeah,
I don't like what Hamas did on October 7th either. But I mean, Hamas has done a lot more heinous things before then. This was probably one of their worst, but Israel's done just as much before October 7th. So that wasn't their 9/11. And then
those who burn
what they've been doing
burn
after
people.
that, I mean. Yeah. And ironically enough, that's what the Nazis did. They burned books and then they started burning people. And that's exactly what Israel is doing. That's what the United States is doing. And we have people that are supporting it. I call it, I think it's more ignorance. I mean, I'd like to say most evangelicals are not evil people. They don't want to watch babies getting maimed and dismembered. I mean, but they are ignorant, because I mean, it's kind of like what's the old saying, just out of sight, out of mind, right? So what I can't see, it really happening. But I mean, but the United States has to go over there, and they have to kill evil. They have to destroy evil, because they're evil over there.
Yeah.
So, and it's sad.
It's like what George W. Bush said: we have to make the world safe for democracy by bombing 4.5 million Muslims.
It's good for ratings.
Yeah. Oh, it sure is.
It is. It's big time. Speaking of the petrodollar, it is definitely, and I think we actually discussed this on our last episode, Andrew. It was mentioned. The petrodollar's done. They're already trading oil and won. So I mean, once trading in another currency, it's no longer the monopoly is over. So yeah.
I mean, that's what radical decentralization is all about, right? Breaking it up pieces at a time. Even if it is with a communist co-partner or whatever you want to call it.
So, I think we've gone almost the hour and a half point. We've gone way over time.
Yeah, no, it's been great, guys.
Yeah, so we love it when we get to we go over. I don't even realize it, but so. But we probably should go ahead and wrap this up before it gets too late. We could probably go on and on and on. We could probably go, like, honestly, 3 days straight if we really wanted to, if we were up to it and didn't have lives outside of this, right?
Yeah.
Didn't need to sleep, we could probably just go. So, but let's wrap this up. Anything else to say? Anything to plug in, Alex, or anything else you want to say to wrap things up?
Yeah, like I said, man, I just really appreciate you guys having me on the show today. This has been a ton of fun. I've really enjoyed talking with you guys today. Like I said, my podcast is called the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, Biblical Studies and Libertarian Philosophy, combining the two of those. And the organization I work for is the Libertarian Christian Institute. Again, a lot of great content. So libertarianchristians.com. And, I know you and me, Zach, are mutuals on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @ProLibertyPod. So come over and give me a fight. If you like Zach stuff, you're gonna like what I do. Andrew, are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, but I never use it, so I'll definitely be following you in just a minute.
Yeah, you're. I was looking for your profile and I couldn't find it. So if you follow me, I'll definitely follow you back.
Okay.
It's a Detective Conan. Yeah. Just look for the Detective Conan.
Nice.
I don't know. It might not be Detective Conan now.
Yeah.
So, Yeah. Anyways, Andrew, anything in your corner?
No, I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for checking in.
Cool. Can you wanna for this episode and everything that we've talked about, you wanna give a little explanation to that quote behind you that Max Turner wrote about?
Yeah. Well, basically,
The
neutrality is a fleeting asset, and you have to use it when you can and be able to grow through it. So people put a lot of pressure on you to do things that they think is moral and ethical, and you have to be able to buck and say no. I have my own way of thinking, and I'll do it as I need to.
Otherwise, you'll forget exactly what
Who
life was
you are
all
as a
about.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, the future isn't so bright because what was there to live for, right? So it's like we were talking about. Like, you want a king, okay, well, you're going to live with the consequences of having that said king. So and that's so that I'm glad that was your background today, because I think everything that we talked about, from the Bible to history to foreign policy to everything we bounced about, that quote right there: the men of the future will yet fight the men of the future will yet fight their way to many a liberty that they do not ever miss. And I think that kind of explains everything, and it explains the biblical narrative as well, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and why the scripture had to be restored with Jesus' birth and inevitable death and the resurrection of the New Testament, because of the faults, the men forgetting their way,
What is
and not understanding what the future could be. And so you needed the New Testament for the Old Testament to be revered. So and then you have the evangelicals that want to prop up Israel and build up the temple so they can have their death cult and Jesus can come back and everything can be restored. So 1,000 years, we need 1,000 years and Jesus can come back. That's a little dangerous, because wasn't the Third Reich supposed to run for 1,000 years?
The 1,000-year Reich. Yep.
But before we step onto a tangent, this has been a wonderful conversation. Would love to have you come back and discuss further, Alex, if you would have that down the road. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And with that, let's go ahead and reel it in then. So I again am the legacy of Jennifer Kaiser, and I am Zachary Kaiser. This is Andrew Joseph. He's Alex Bernardo of Protestant Libertarian. Almost screwed that up. How can I do that? So, and this is the legacy, right? Peace.
See ya.
And
thanks for watching.
Peace.
This has been great, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.